Hi guys, this is the first video for the 4-week certificate course on PoSH by Legal Vidhiya, and in this video we'll be understanding the concept of sexual harassment. So it is very clear कि sexual harassment दो words से बना है, that is sexual and harassment. So sexual basically means any kind of behavior or any comment or any type of action that is related to a person's sex or gender and that is of sexual nature. And harassment basically means any kind of unwanted behavior or conduct or action that causes discomfort or any kind of intimidation to the other person, that is the victim जिसके साथ harassment हो रहा है. So, any kind of sexual unwanted behavior that causes intimidation or discomfort can be termed as sexual harassment. Now, when we talk about the definition, it is very simple. So, sexual harassment is any unwelcome act. It can be any kind of advances, that is, any kind of approaches that a person is making, any kind of comment, request for sexual favors, or any form of harassment, including verbal harassment, that is, including comments about a person, that all contributes to a creation of hostile work environment. Now, a hostile work environment is one where a person cannot work to his full capacity because of the situation he or she is facing. That is because of the ill treatment that that person is facing, which causes him physical or even mental distress. Now, there are various definitions given for sexual harassment. We'll be talking of five of them. The first is of CEDAW committee, that is on the Convention of Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. Right, there was a committee regarding this, and they said that sexual harassment is a form of gender-specific violence against women. Now they're talking specifically about women, and hence they've said that this is a gender-specific violence. Then there's United States Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, will say that USEEOC. Okay, so they said that sexual harassment is unwelcome sexual advances, request for sexual favors, and any other verbal or physical conduct of sexual nature that constitutes sexual harassment when this conduct explicitly or implicitly affects an individual's employment, unreasonably interferes with an individual's work performance, and creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment. So, this definition basically states that sexual harassment is when any act is done जो कि sexual nature में हो एंड जिसके कारण एक एम्प्लॉय की जो वर्किंग कैपेसिटी है वो कम हो जाए एंड it when that particular act, that is that sexual harassment act, creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment, then any such act is known as sexual harassment. Then under Title 9 of the Education Amendments of 1972 of the US Department of Education, sexual harassment is defined as unwelcome conduct on basis of sex, including sexual orientation and gender identity. Sexual harassment involves unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal, non-verbal, graphic, or physical conduct of sexual nature or based on sexual orientation or gender identity. Now, any kind of act that is not welcome by the other person, that is something that the person is not expecting, which is based on their sexual orientation, that is whether they are male or female, or their gender, that is male or female, or whether they identify as any other third gender, say. Now, if they're facing any kind of discrimination regarding this, or if they're facing any kind of threats regarding this, or anything they're facing which is contributing to an hostile work environment, then any such act will constitute to sexual harassment. Then, as per the Australian Human Rights Commission, sexual harassment is unwelcome sexual conduct which makes a person feel offended, humiliated, or intimidated, where that reaction is reasonable in the circumstances. Sexual harassment basically means, in this definition, any kind of unwelcome sexual conduct that makes a person feel intimidated, humiliated, or offended. And it must be reasonable, that is the only condition. Then we have the PoSH Act, that is the Sexual Harassment of Women at Workplace Prevention, Prohibition and Redressal Act of 2013, which is an act of India. Under Section 2, subsection 9, sexual harassment is defined, and it says that sexual harassment includes any one or more of the following unwelcome acts or behavior. Now, what are those unwelcome acts? So, under our law, we have said any physical contact or advance, any demand or request for sexual favors, making sexually colored remarks, showing pornography, or any other unwelcome physical, verbal, or non-verbal conduct of sexual nature. Now, any such thing will constitute sexual harassment. Now, when we look at all these five definitions, few things are common in all of them. What are that? That is, sexual harassment is an unwelcome act. Now, this unwelcome act, what it does is it creates an hostile work environment, or it creates fear in the mind of the victim, or it makes them feel offended. Now, sexual harassment in all of these definitions, it can be the physical, it can be verbal, or it can be graphic, as has been defined. Now, let's try to understand some acts that might constitute sexual harassment. Now, the first is making employment or advancement contingent on sexual flavors, whether explicitly stated or implied. Now, this basically means that quid pro quo situation. Quid pro quo is this for that or something in return for something. So basically, when your employer, say for example, he's your senior, he's a manager, he makes it contingent that तुम्हें ये नौकरी मिलेगी only if you go on a date with me, या फिर तुम्हें ये प्रमोशन मिलेगा only if you go on this date with me. जब वो ऐसा कुछ बोलता है तो that constitutes an act of sexual harassment, and that is what the first one is trying to say. Second is engaging in physical acts of sexual assault. That is, कोई भी अगर सामने वाले इंसान को ज़बरदस्ती छूने की कोशिश करता है विदाउट देयर कंसेंट, दिस इज ऑब्वियसली सेक्शुअल हरासमेंट. देन सॉलिसिटिंग सेक्शुअल फेवर्स, इसका मतलब होता है आस्किंग फॉर सेक्शुअल फेवर्स. इसका मतलब कोई भी आपका एम्प्लॉयर या फिर आपका पीयर या फिर कोलीग जो आपके साथ काम कर रहा है वो सीधा आपसे आके बोले टू एंगेज इन सेक्शुअल एक्टिविटी, कि मेरे साथ किसी सेक्शुअल एक्टिविटी में एंगेज हो जाए या फिर मेरे साथ डेट पे चलो. नाउ even when you have said no, that is something what the third point is trying to say. Then there is subjecting the victim to verbal harassment of sexual nature, including jokes referencing sexual acts or orientation. Now, this basically means talking about sexual things in a way that makes the other person uncomfortable, such as उनका पर्सनल लाइफ डिस्कस करना या फिर सेक्सुअल जोक्स बोलना in places that it is inappropriate, and that is work or school situations. Then unwanted physical touching or contact, very straightforward. If anyone is trying to get close to you physically when you have said no explicitly, then that will also constitute sexual harassment. Then making unwelcome sexual advances, that is, कोई आपके साथ अगर बार बार रोमांटिकली इन्वॉल्व होने की कोशिश करे, जैसे फॉर एग्जांपल यू हैव अ मैनेजर जो बार बार आपको अप्रोच कर रहा हो कि गो आउट ऑन दिस डेट विथ मी, या फिर मेरे साथ वहाँ चलो, मेरे साथ वहाँ चलो, और मे बी ही इज़ इवन डायरेक्टली सेइंग कि डेट मी और be in a relationship with me when you have said no. Doing this again and again will make a person emotionally fed up and distressed. Now, that will also create a hostile work environment, and hence it constitutes sexual harassment. Then is discussing sexual relations, stories or fantasies in inappropriate settings. काफ़ी स्ट्रेट फॉरवर्ड है ये भी कि सेक्सुअल जोक्स या फिर किसी की प्राइवेट लाइफ डिस्कस करना या फिर कुछ ऐसी इनअप्रोप्रिएट बात करना इन योर वर्क एनवायरनमेंट और स्कूल एनवायरनमेंट, जहाँ पे जो सामने वाला बंदा वो सुन के अनकम्फर्टेबल हो जाए. That will also constitute sexual harassment. Then there's feeling pressured into engaging in sexual activities. Most of the common, I'd say, sexual harassment is when the other person is forcing the victim to engage in sexual activities, and the other person, being a junior, is feeling pressured to do it. So, if you're feeling pressured into engaging in sexual activities, by a superior or by your peers, that was also sexual harassment. Then exposing oneself or performing sexual acts on oneself. नाउ वी ऑल नो कि जब आप वर्क पे होते हो या फिर स्कूल में होते हो या फिर कॉलेज में होते हो, एक मिनिमम डिसेंसी आपको मेंटेन करनी चाहिए. नाउ इफ the person is not doing that and is exposing himself or herself or doing something that is inappropriate or even showing graphics that are inappropriate to the other person without their consent, that would constitute sexual harassment. Now basically sexual harassment कब होता है? From all this it is clear जब कुछ unwanted activity हो आपके साथ which is of sexual nature and which you do not want to involve in, एंड जिसके होने के कारण एक हॉस्टल वर्क एनवायरनमेंट क्रिएट हो जाए, दैट इज़ एक इंटिमिडेटिंग वर्क एनवायरनमेंट क्रिएट हो जाए या फिर एक ऑफेंसिव वर्क एनवायरनमेंट क्रिएट हो जाए जहाँ पे आप अच्छे से काम ना कर पाओ, वेर यू कुड नॉट शो योर फुल पोटेंशियल. Now that is something that would constitute sexual harassment. Now that we have understood that, there are two topics, that is workplace harassment and sexual abuse. So we'll see the difference between sexual harassment and both these two topics, beginning with sexual harassment versus workplace harassment. Now जब हम लोग sexual harassment की बात करते हैं, it is any unwelcome sexual advances or comments or conduct that creates a hostile work environment based on gender. But when we talk about workplace harassment, it is a broader term and it includes a part of sexual harassment, no doubt, but उसके अलावा भी काफ़ी चीज़ें होती है जो एक workplace harassment में constitute करती है, and it is not specifically based on your gender. Then sexual harassment, as I've stated, term ही sexual है, that is it is sexual in nature and it is based on gender, whereas workplace harassment, it is a wider range of behaviors including bullying and discrimination which may or may not be related to gender. ऐसा नहीं है कि ये gender से बिल्कुल ही related नहीं होगा. It may be related to gender, it may not be related to gender. Sexual harassment जो है एक subset है, that is it is a category of workplace harassment that is occurring due to your gender, whereas workplace harassment is any kind of mistreatment that is happening to you. जब सेक्सुअल हरासमेंट की बात करते हैं, इसके एग्जांपल्स में आ जाता है अनवेलकम फिजिकल टचिंग और मेकिंग सेक्सुअल जोक्स और कमेंट्स. लेकिन जब वर्कप्लेस हरासमेंट की बात करते हैं, इसके एग्जांपल्स में आ जाता है discrimination, verbal abuse, offensive behavior, or bullying, which is unrelated to gender. It might be related to gender, but not fully. Then, sexual harassment and sexual abuse. Sexual harassment is any kind of physical contact and any kind of unwanted physical advance that is of sexual nature in a workplace or other professional institutions or social situations. Whereas sexual abuse is non consensual sexual activity which can include rape, molestation, and any other form of sexual violence. Sexual harassment की जब हम बात करते हैं, it can occur in various settings including your workplace, educational institute, or public spaces, or any place that you visit. But sexual abuse is usually in private, but also it can happen in some public spheres. Now the law governing the two in India. जब हम लोग sexual harassment की बात करते हैं, it is governed by PoSH, that is the Sexual Harassment of Women at Workplace Prevention, Prohibition and Redressal Act. But जब sexual abuse की बात करते हैं, there is the Indian Penal Code, then there is the POCSO, that is Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act, and various other state legislations भी होंगे that help curb the issue of sexual abuse. Then we have complaint mechanism. When we talk of sexual harassment, we have internal complaint mechanisms, that we have ICs, and उसके अलावा we have LCs जो कमिटीज़ बैठती हैं और जो इस एक्ट के अंदर, दैट इज़ पॉश के अंदर, कंप्लेंट्स फाइल करती है, इंक्वायरी करती है और अपनी रिपोर्ट देती है. लेकिन जब सेक्सुअल अब्यूज़ की बात करते हैं, इसका रिपोर्टिंग मैकेनिज्म बहुत अलग है. इन दिस वी यूजुअली रिपोर्ट टू पुलिस और द चाइल्ड प्रोटेक्शन एजेंसीज या सर्विसेज, एज द केस में बी. Now penalties. Sexual harassment की जब हम बात करते हैं, इसमें आपको वार्निंग्स दी जाती है, आपका ट्रांसफ़र हो सकता है इफ़ यू आर द परपेट्रेटर, और देयर कैन बी other legal action depending on the severity. But when we talk of sexual abuse, from imprisonments to fines to death penalties, all of these can happen depending on the nature and severity of the offense. So, this is the difference between sexual harassment and sexual abuse. Now, that is it for this video, and the next video we'll be talking of the forms of sexual harassment. I hope you learned something from this video and have a good day. Thank you.